African American slaves began creating songs describing their daily lives as they were forced into labor. Despite constant oppression, they used these songs to keep their culture and religion alive through storytelling, communicate grievances and escape plans through hidden messages, and preserve their own culture through oral accounts. The singing of these songs paved the way for future artistic genres of music and kept their culture alive over centuries of subjugation. African American spirituals show a wide range of emotions, from great happiness to intense sadness. These songs were central to a slave's expression of themselves and show the emotional impact that bondage has had on these people. Spirituals were sometimes known as sorrow songs for their sad and emotional quality. There were even songs people would sing in the mourning of the death of a loved one. In one song, the family would march around the coffin singing the hymn. In Frederick Douglass's book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he talks about how slave songs are mostly sad because the enslaved people sang when they were unhappy. These songs elaborate on the sorrows of these people, which, in the writing of these songs, helped them to feel better about their situation. These spirituals served as coping mechanisms for the sufferers of bondage. Some spirituals contained feelings of joy and happiness. Some celebrated the little and the big victories, while others reveled in the glory of God. Henry Box Brown was an African American enslaved person from Virginia who escaped to Philadelphia by mailing himself in a wooden crate. As a result of his success, he wrote a song about his journey where he ends by expressing his happiness and noting that he was set free from his pain. Many songs also contain feelings of hope and longing for a better future. They tie this hope in with their religion and pray for a better tomorrow. These enslaved people not only expressed their emotions in these songs, but also their morals. They recognized that being victimized by oppressive slave owners does not excuse any violence within their own community. Some spirituals stress that one should not feel free to treat others poorly. They acknowledge that some people within their community have made bad decisions, so they strive to reduce mistreatment of each other. It is sung in some spirituals of how slaves must be patient in their current lives in order to triumph in the next. However, the focus on which life alternates from song to song. Because of the constant and nearly unavoidable oppression they face, some slaves feel that there is no value to their life on earth, so they look forward to their life on heaven. On the contrary, some slaves feel that they can improve their life on ground by escape or other means and value their time on earth. During the American slavery period, African American slaves used religious music to distract them from the pain of abusive slave owners. They sung with hopes that God would separate them from their oppressors. These people wrote spirituals in order to heal emotionally and distract them from their hardship. African American spirituals show desire for better lives with the goal of freedom. In the writing of some spirituals, black slaves matched their own experiences with biblical stories and put the scripture to song. In one story they particularly liked, they saw themselves as the oppressed Israelites going against the cruel Egyptians, which were the slave owners. Canaan represented freedom. Focusing on biblical stories rather than their own hardship likely served as a temporary distraction from the cruel treatment they endured. The spiritual Wrestling Jacob describes the events of biblical struggle between Jacob and an angel. The original scripture doesn't express the story very well. It is the music that adds the emotion and imagination to it. This spiritual details a biblical struggle in which a deeper way than the scripture did, showing how powerful some spirituals are in evoking emotion and portraying a scene. Years after the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, African Americans continued to sing these songs, expressing their sadness for their prolonged poor treatment and subpar living conditions. The continued sense of despair present years after release from bondage shows how slow history can be when making positive change. Some spirituals became known as freedom songs, which sought to express the feelings of civil rights activists during the civil rights movement. Both old songs from slavery and new songs were sung to promote this movement. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Why We Can't Wait, he explains that the freedom songs were crucial to the mass musical selections for black and white activists of the civil rights era. African American spirituals were often sung in protest during the 19th and 20th centuries. In the latter half of the 20th century, the civil rights movement among churches allowed for the singing of these spirituals alongside hymns and freedom songs. Here, slave spirituals are being used as historically symbolic subjects to represent a culture. The use of spirituals extended to civil rights issues as African Americans continued to harbor feelings of unequal treatment. Spirituals reveal a history of struggling for emancipation and survival through the creation of secret codes and veiled criticism. It is noteworthy that the commentary on life and critique of living conditions as an African American slave served as a historical record. The only real way slaves could communicate criticisms without punishment is through coded song, and these songs are the reasons why historians today have a wealth of information on how American slaves were treated and their plans of escape. Many African American spirituals had coded messages written into them that had different meanings from their literal meanings, which bypassed the minds of slave owners. One spiritual, Steal Away, announced to slaves that religious gathering would occur that night. This song was consistently sung throughout the day to get the word out. This was likely hidden in song because of religious or meeting restrictions slave owners put on their slaves. Some African American spirituals had a purpose of organizing people for specific gatherings. These were not only composed of peaceful meetings discussing religion, but also revolts and rebellions against their slave owners. The secret code here is not individual words, but rather entire songs. When the whole song is heard, slaves became aware of the event happening, rather than hearing a specific word that triggers understanding. Some spirituals frequently mention bodies of water in their lyrics. However, their significance goes further beyond the literal. These subjects served as guides, indicating which rivers are good to follow to freedom, or how to make use of water to aid in escape. When a song mentions the biblical crossing of the Jordan River and going to Canaan, not only could it mean dying, but it could also mean crossing the Ohio River and entering a free state. The song Hold On has many double meanings within it. The refrain mentions keep your hand on the plow, which not only encourages the slaves to continue working, but the plow is another name for the Ursa Major constellation, also known as the drinking gourd, that points to the North Star. This serves as encouragement to continue heading north to be free. The rest of the song hints at secret services for runways and a preacher giving an escape plan. The driving rhythm makes the song a good work song, but the meanings behind the lyrics gives working slaves hope and comfort that it is possible to escape and there's a better life up north. Due to the fact that African Americans were legally prevented from learning how to read or write, they developed an oral tradition of singing. They began sharing their lives through speech, and much of this was done through the composing and singing of slave songs. Since African American slaves couldn't express their ideas on paper, they communicated details of their lives verbally. This is why there is such a rich oral account of the life of American slaves during the antebellum era. Frederick Douglass comments on how these songs showed the true nature of slavery. One would understand the experiences of these enslaved people much better through their songs than the books of philosophy explaining them. These songs are the most important aspect of slavery in our understanding of it today, portraying a more realistic view of a life in bondage. These songs were also used as a means of communication. African American slaves detailed clear accounts of their daily lives, leaving traces on how they lived during the antebellum period. This information allows for historians to peer into the daily lives of these people. The dialogue within the songs is crucial in detailing their living conditions. African slaves brought to the Americas did not leave all their cultural practices behind in Africa. They brought native melodies which they taught to their youth and carried on through generations by means of secret meetings. This shows that, despite the constant oppression that slaves were receiving from their owners in the New World, they still preserved their cultural identity through the writing of these songs. The slave song I'm Gwine to Alabama was sung in some western steamboats and has more prominent qualities tying it to African music. It has the barbaric quality that many secular slave songs depict. This can be seen in the large slurs and prolonging of the vowels o and ah. The notation of these characteristics plays a large part in the preservation of African melodies during the American antebellum period. As spirituals were adapted to new musical forms, gospel singing gained popularity with its added harmonies and new performance techniques. Even with all this change, many of the original lyrics of the spirituals were still preserved. African culture and history continued to withstand the test of time as it took on different forms of spiritual singing. When the original African slaves came to America, they incorporated their traditional rhythms in their singing of spirituals. As spirituals evolved, the content of them remained. African American spirituals played a major role in the lives of African American slaves, allowing for them to express themselves and tell their stories. They also served as motivators to help the enslaved persons get through a day of hard work and carry deep meanings unknown by their owners. It is our duty as Americans to preserve these songs, for they served as liberators for enslaved persons, and today serve as symbols for the enslaved person's fight for freedom.